Washington holds some of the most intriguing ancient mysteries in the Pacific Northwest. From puzzling basalt formations and lost settlements to tribal legends of powerful beings tied to the mountains and rivers, the state hides stories that blur the line between history and myth. These mysteries invite you to look deeper into a land shaped by forces both natural and unexplained. The mysterious rock towers of Dry Falls. If you've ever stood at the edge of Dry Falls in central Washington, you know the place hits you with a strange mix of scale and silence. The cliffs stretch out like the bones of an ancient world, and the air feels heavier than it should. Most people come expecting a dramatic viewpoint. What they don't always expect are the stone towers, odd vertical stacks scattered around the basin and neighboring coulees, standing like watchmen from a forgotten chapter of the region's past. They aren't marked on most tourist maps, and you won't find many official signs pointing them out. Yet, they're there, stubbornly rising from the fractured basalt, daring you to figure out who or what first shaped them. On paper, Dry Falls is a geological site, a massive ice age waterfall, a scar left by floods so big they make modern rivers look like garden hoses. But once you get down to the basin, the story feels different. The terrain doesn't sit neatly in the nature did it category. There are columns that look too intentional, too structured, too arranged. Some seem balanced in ways that make no sense for something left behind by random erosion. And that's where the mystery really begins. Local tribes have legends about the area that go long before geology textbooks try to explain it. The stories talk about spirits living in the cliffs, tall beings that shape stone as easily as we knead clay. Other stories mention ancient battles where powerful beings hurled rocks at each other, leaving behind towers, ramparts, and broken formations scattered across the ground. When you compare those stories to the actual layout of the rock towers, the parallels are hard to ignore. Some of the towers sit in defensible-looking inclinies, others curve in semicircles. The way you'd arrange fortifications if you were trying to protect a particular spot. Of course, the scientific explanation says the towers are basalt columns broken down by time, and that may be true for many of them, but some of the stacks don't behave like natural basalt at all. They feature stones of different sizes placed on top of each other in a way that doesn't match the surrounding geology. And when you hike closer and really study the ground, you find little oddities. Flat slab-like rocks that look intentionally positioned. Rounded stones resting on sharp edges without falling gaps between rocks that are so tight and straight they look like puzzle pieces. I remember walking through one of the side canyons near the lower basin. The light was beginning to fade the way it does when the sun slides behind the cliffs and the floor turned cool and shadowy. One of the towers there stood about 15 feet tall, built from stones that looked nothing like the uniform basalt pillars nearby. If you touched the lower stones, they felt almost polished. Not smooth like river stones, but worn in a way that implied hands, not just time. It's one of those moments where your brain quietly switches from "this is a geological feature" to "someone did this." You feel it before you realize you're thinking it. Archaeologists don't usually classify these towers as structures, which means the mystery often flies under the radar, but hikers, photographers, and the occasional rock hunting enthusiasts have been talking about them for decades. Some swear a few of the towers change after storms, knocked down, rebuilt, or subtly rearranged. It could simply be nature pulling pranks, but the changes sometimes look more deliberate than that. Balanced stones don't shift into perfect stacks without something or someone moving them. There's also the question of age. If the towers were built by human hands, who did it? The known archaeological record in this part of Washington goes back thousands of years. There were native communities who lived, hunted, and traveled through the region long before the floods shaped the land. But no tribe today claims the towers as their creation, at least not publicly. Some elders say the towers were already old when their ancestors first arrived. Others avoid the topic altogether, which almost feels more revealing than an answer. You also have the strange alignments. A few of the taller stacks line up with sunrise points, during a couple of them align with breaks in the cliffs that could have served as navigation markers long before people had maps. It raises the possibility that the towers weren't shelters or ceremonial features, but something more practical. Landmarks, astronomical guides, or even messages left in stone across the country. There's also the acoustic side of Dry Falls that most visitors never notice. Some of the rock towers sit in spots where the wind creates odd resonance. You can hear whistling low tones, even soft echoes that shouldn't exist in open terrain. It's easy to imagine ancient people using sound to determine where to build, or perhaps believing certain spots carried spiritual significance. In places like this, sound behaves almost like a hidden language. Then there's the energy of the place, and I don't mean that in a mystical way, more in the sense of atmosphere. Dry Falls feels eerie, beautiful, but eerie. The air gets still. The shadows fall sharply. Even the birds seem quieter. When you stand near one of the towers, you get the sense of being watched even though you're alone. Maybe it's the scale of the cliffs, maybe it's the silence. Or maybe it's the fact that the towers look like sentinels standing frozen in time. Over the years, a handful of researchers have tried to get formal studies approved. Most proposals get dismissed as unnecessary since the formations are officially labeled natural features, but a few independent investigators claim to have found chisel marks on some stones, light, shallow, almost erased by weather. The marks don't prove anything on their own, but they open the door to a possibility that the mainstream explanation doesn't fully consider. Some of the mysteries may never be solved because the terrain itself works against you. Dry Falls is harsh. The ground shifts, rocks slide, basalt crumbles, streams carve new channels every time there's heavy rain. Anything built long ago would have been battered for centuries. Whatever remains today might just be the last hints of something bigger, something that once had shape and meaning. And yet, for all the questions, the towers still stand. They're quiet, patient, balanced between the world we understand and the one we're still trying to decipher. When you visit Dry Falls today, you'll see families taking photos, road trippers stretching their legs, hikers enjoying the open landscape. But if you wander a little farther down the trails into the coulees below, you'll find those towers waiting. They don't advertise themselves. You have to look for them. You have to pay attention. In the end, maybe that's part of what makes this mystery so compelling. It's not just about who built the towers or how old they are. It's about why they exist in a place where everything else is shaped by violence, by floods, by collapse, by the raw power of ice and water. The towers feel stubborn, almost defiant. They remind you that not every mark on the landscape comes with a neat explanation. And when you finally climb back up to the overlook and look out across that massive dry waterfall, a cliff face so wide and once dwarfed, Niagara, you can't help but wonder how many stories like this the land is hiding. How many secrets sit just out of sight, disguised as ordinary rock, so many mysteries we walk right past without realizing it. Dry Falls is quiet now. The water is gone, but the towers remain, holding their place in the wind, watching time move around them. And until someone figures them out, they'll keep standing there. Part monument, part puzzle, part reminder that even in a place shaped by nature's fury, something humaner may be, something older still lingers in the stone. The Mount Rainier, Old Ones legends. If you spend enough time around Mount Rainier, talk to the rangers, the climbers, the longtime locals, you start hearing stories that don't show up in guidebooks. The mountain has that kind of pull. It's huge, icy, unpredictable, and beautiful in a way that feels a bit intimidating, but the legends around it run much deeper than weather patterns or climbing routes. One of the oldest and honestly the most unsettling is the set of stories about the Old Ones, mysterious beings said to have lived in the high valleys and glacial caves long before people ever arrived in the region. Some tribes still avoid certain areas of the mountain because of them. And once you hear the stories, you understand why. The first time I came across the Old Ones legends, I was digging through early ethnographic notes from the 1800s. Researchers kept describing strange warnings given by local tribes. Don't sleep too close to the high glaciers. Don't whistle in certain valleys. Don't go near the ice caves at night. The explanations were always vague, but they all hinted at the same presence, something ancient, something that watched. According to the stories, the Old Ones weren't spirits in the usual sense. They were described as tall beings, sometimes human-shaped, other times more like shadows with form. They lived beneath the glacier shelves deep inside the ice caverns carved by meltwater. And they weren't friendly or hostile in a human way. They were simply there observing, waiting, almost like the mountain's original inhabitants who never moved on. One tale from the Cowits people talks about hunters who followed elk tracks up beyond the Trion. They reached a ridge where the snow was untouched except for a set of long straight footprints. Not the stride of an animal, not the irregular pattern of a human. The hunters turned back immediately. They said the tracks belonged to the ancient walkers. Looking at the distance between each print, you can understand why. Whatever made them was tall, very tall, Another story comes from the Yakama side of the mountain. Elders described the Old Ones as beings made of cold mist and mountain wind. They could shift shape almost like figures half formed out of the fog. They weren't gods, but they weren't physical people either. They existed somewhere in between. Travelers who slept too close to the glaciers sometimes woke up feeling watched or with dreams of figures standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. Even today, there are climbers who swear they felt that same presence while making their way up the Disappointment Cleaver route. What's interesting is how consistently these stories appear across different tribal nations, each separated by geography, language, and culture. Yet they share the same core idea that Mount Rainier houses something ancient and sentient. The mountain isn't just a landmark alive in a deeper sense. When you spend time up there, especially in the quieter areas away from the visitor centers, the idea doesn't sound quite as far-fetched. The air feels different, the silence is almost too heavy, like the mountain is listening. Even the forests around Rainier have an atmosphere that's hard to explain. Massive trees, thick moss, waterfalls that cut through the brush with constant white noise. It creates an environment where you feel both small and exposed. And then there's the fog. Rainier produces fog that rolls through the trees and slow drifting sheets, making shapes you swear are people standing still until the wind scatters them. I remember hiking one of the lesser-used trails near the glacier edge. The temperature dropped fast. 1 minute I was walking through late summer warmth. The next, the air felt like winter. A low whistle echoed from somewhere above. Even though the sky was clear and still, it wasn't wind. It was more like a breath, long, steady, almost measured. Moments like that make the Old Ones' legends feel less like stories and more like old warnings that still apply. There's also the matter of the caves. Most visitors don't know this, but Rainier is full of ice caves, long twisting corridors carved out by meltwater beneath the glaciers. They're dangerous places, always shifting, always creaking, always one warm day away from collapse. But long before scientists warned people to stay out, the tribes had already marked the caves as forbidden, not because of geology, because of the Old Ones. They said the caves were their homes and that anyone who entered without permission might not return. Modern climbers have reported strange sounds inside those caverns. Whispering footsteps behind them, the feeling of being followed. A couple of rescue teams have said the same thing. It's easy to choke that up to echoes, to the way sound bounces off ice, to adrenaline. But when you start hearing it from people who don't believe in legends, you pay attention. There's also a strange pattern of disappearances around the mountain. Park officials will tell you that most cases are accidents, hidden creases, sudden storms, dehydration, people getting lost after dark, and that's probably true for many of them. But a handful of disappearances happened on clear days on marked trails with experienced hikers who knew the mountain well. Their gear was found intact, footprints vanished mid-trail, search dogs followed scent into areas that ended abruptly as if the person simply stepped off the map. You can't help but think about the Old Ones' stories when you read those reports. Some researchers tried to connect the Old Ones' legends to early encounters with glaciers themselves. They argued that the shifting ice, the booming sounds inside caverns, the unexpected cracks and movements could have frightened early people into creating supernatural explanations. And maybe there's truth in that. Mountains can play tricks on your senses, but the specificity of the descriptions, the tall figures, the watchers in the fog, the ancient presence beneath the ice goes beyond simple fear of natural hazards. There's also the possibility that the legends were based on early memories of other groups of humans, ancient tribes or older cultures that lived near the glaciers and later disappeared. In that sense, Old Ones might have referred to real people who lived in places modern hikers wouldn't dare approach. But if that's the case, why describe them the way the tribes did? Why the emphasis on their height, their silence, their connection to the cold? What always strikes me about these stories is how quietly they persist. They aren't shouted, they aren't turned into dramatic campfire tallis. They're spoken softly as if the mountain might overhear. Even today, some tribal members won't say the names of the Old Ones in certain parts of the forest. They'll change the subject or redirect you towards safer topics. That kind of caution comes from somewhere. When you visit Rainier today, you see families walking paradise meadows, climbers prepping at base camp, and tourists snapping photos of the park. Feels welcoming, almost gentle in the summer light. But the higher you go, the more the mood shifts. The pressure changes, the cold creeps in, the wind turns strange. You start to understand why people once believed the mountain belonged to someone else long before humans showed up. Maybe the old ones are metaphors for the mountain's raw power personified, warnings to respect a place that can shift from calm to deadly faster than you expect. Maybe there are remnants of ancient memories passed down through generations. Or maybe, just maybe, the stories describe something that still moves in the unseen places of Rainier. Something older than any tribe, older than the forests, older even than the glaciers grinding slowly down its flanks. Whatever the truth is, the feeling stays with you long after you leave. Rainier has that effect. You can walk the trails, breathe the wildflower air, enjoy the postcard views. But if you pause in the right spot at the right time when the fog drifts low and the mountain goes quiet, you might sense what people have felt for centuries. That you're not alone up there, that something ancient is watching from the edge of the ice. And whether the old ones are legends or something more, they're part of the mountain's identity. Reminder that even in a place mapped and measured by humans, there are still corners that belong to the unknown. The Yakama Nation legends of the tall beings. If you spend any time in the Yak Valley, especially out toward the foothills where the pines thicken and the ridge lines start folding in on each other, you can feel the history in the landscape. It's quiet in a very specific way. The wind moves through the sagebrush. You hear distant water cutting through canyons, and every now and then you catch a sense that you're re-walking across grounds that hold stories much older than anything written in books. One of the oldest and definitely one of the strangest comes from the Yakama Nation. They talk about mysterious figures known as the tall beings, giant watchers who lived in the high places long before the first human footsteps crossed the Columbia Plateau. The tall beings don't fit neatly into the categories people usually attach to native legends. They aren't monsters, they aren't gods, and they aren't tricksters. They're described almost like an older race, silent, powerful, observant, and deeply tied to the mountains, the dense forests, and the hidden valleys that surround central Washington. Depending on who tells the story, they either lived peacefully alongside early people or kept their distance, watching from the edges of forests and canyons, but rarely interacting. One of the oldest stories goes back to the days when the Yakama people were moving seasonally through the valley. Hunters traveling at dusk would sometimes see shapes on the cliff as tall silhouettes standing perfectly still like they were carved out of the rock itself. The men said these figures stood twice the height of a human and moved with long fluid strides that weren't quite natural. The hunters would describe coming home with an odd sense of being followed even though nothing made a sound behind them. And in those times, nobody whistled or sang while traveling alone. That instinct came from somewhere. One elder described them as the guardians who walked the ridges before people came. That line stuck with me because it captures the tone most Yakama stories use when talking about the tall beings. Not fearful, but cautious, respectful, like they were ancient neighbors best left undisturbed. People weren't supposed to seek them out. If the tall beings wanted to be seen, they appeared on their own terms. If they didn't, no amount of searching would bring you close. There are also stories about enormous footprints found in the mud after autumn rains. Prints with a length and stride no human could match. In modern times, these kinds of details usually get folded into Bigfoot discussions, but the Yakama legends existed long before any European settlers recorded similar stories. And the tall beings aren't described the same way. They aren't covered in hair or lumbering through the woods there. Tall, lean, and quiet, almost graceful, more like tall humans whose features stay hidden in shadow. There's one story that really stands out. A long time ago, a group of Yakama fishermen camped along a river that flowed out of the highlands. During the night, they heard a deep rhythmic tapping from somewhere upstream, like someone gently striking a hollow log. The next morning, large stones had been stacked near their camp, carefully balanced, almost like markers. No tracks led to them. The fishermen took it as a sign from the tall beings and left offerings of fish and roots before breaking camp. They said it wasn't fear that made them go, it was respect, a feeling that the land belonged to someone older and they were just guests passing through. Another legend talks about children wandering away from camp and getting lost in the forest. When the parents found them, they said a tall figure had guided them back toward the river. The children described the being as almost blending with the trees, quiet and gentle. The adults believed the tall beings sometimes acted as protectors, but only when someone was truly vulnerable. They weren't guardian angels, they were more like ancient inhabitants who didn't want unnecessary harm on the land they lived in. But these stories also have a darker edge. There are warnings in Yakama oral tradition about traveling too close to certain mountain passes at night. One legend says the tall beings would sometimes gather on the ridges during storms. Lightning would flash and the watchers would appear for a moment, towering silhouettes standing shoulder to shoulder facing the valley below. No one knew what they were watching for. The message was always the same. Don't be there when they gather. Some places belong to them alone. What fascinates me is how consistent these descriptions are across generations. When you talk to Yakama elders today, some still repeat the warnings their grandparents gave them. Do you whistle after dark in the high country? Don't walk alone near the old growth on the east ridges. Don't try to see the tall beams. They'll appear only if they choose to. And if they do, pay attention to what the mountain is telling you. Modern sightings aren't talked about publicly, but they exist. Hunters say they felt watched from tree lines that were too quiet, even for the wilderness. A few hikers have claimed they saw a tall shape behind a tree at dusk, only for it to vanish without a sound. There are also reports of strange stone stacks along remote trails, perfectly balanced columns that look too deliberate to be random debris. And while most people chalk that up to hikers leaving cairns, the locations don't make sense. Nobody builds stacks on steep, isolated ridges where few people travel. The Yakama legends also connect the tall beings to the mountains in a way that feels symbolic and literal at the same time. In the stories, the tall beings came from the high place. See the cliffs, the volcanic peaks, and the deep canyons carved by ancient floods. They were part of the land long before the forests grew or the rivers settled into their modern paths. It creates this sense that Washington's mountains are older that we imagine not just geologically but in the stories rooted within them. There is also a recurring theme that the tall beings were watchers, observers, not hostile, not protective but aware, almost like the land itself needed eyes. The idea that the mountains had their own inhabitants before humans came along gives the legends a kind of weight you feel when you react standing in those forests. The quiet doesn't feel empty, it feels full, like something is listening. I remember walking along a ridge near White Pass during late afternoon. The sky was turning gold and the forest was sinking into that calm silence that happens right before sunset. There were tall pines on either side of the trail, and every few minutes I'd get this odd sense of height around my knot, like someone standing nearby, but like something taller than the trees moving between the shadows. It wasn't fear, just awareness. The same kind of awareness you get when you realize you're on someone else's land, even if you don't see them. When you visit Yakama country today, you see the modern world everywhere. Roads, vineyards, towns, fields, highways. But the moment you step off the pavement and into the forested foothills or the basalt canyons, the atmosphere shifts instantly. You understand how these stories survived. You understand why certain places were avoided. Why certain valleys were considered watching grounds. Why people spoke softly around those areas. The tall beings might be ancient spirits. They might be symbolic reminders to respect the land. They might be early memories of another culture long gone. Or they might be something that still moves through the high forests in ways we do unfully understand. Whatever the truth is, the Yakama legends make one thing clear. The valley was never empty, it was shared. Humans weren't the first to walk those paths. And if you listen closely on a quiet evening, really listen, you might catch a hint of what those early stories were trying to pass down. A shift in the wind, a long measured presence in the trees, a reminder that in the wild places we're never truly alone. The ancient basalt columns of Vantage, if you've ever driven through central Washington on a clear day, high desert stretching out forever. The Columbia River slicing through basalt cliffs. You've seen a landscape that looks almost alien. The air gets dry, the sky opens up, and then suddenly these towering pillars of stone rise out of the earth like something placed there on purpose. That spot is Vantage, and the basalt columns standing along the cliffs are just some of the most mysterious geological formations in the Pacific Northwest, wrapped in stories far older than science could reach. The thing about the basalt columns is that they don't look natural at first glance. They appear so straight, so perfectly geometric, and so deliberately patterned that you could easily believe they were ancient architecture. Long vertical pillars, flat-sided surfaces, stacked edges that fit together like pieces of a giant puzzle. When you first see them, your brain tries to sort them into something human, mad ruins maybe, or the fragments of a forgotten wall. But they're much older than any culture that ever lived here, and their origin story is almost as strange as the legends people tell about them. To really understand why these columns feel mysterious, you have to picture what this region looked like millions of years ago. Not the desert, not the open sky, not the calm river flowing through the canyon. Instead, imagine fire, lava spilling across the land in sheets so wide they covered entire counties. Eruptions that kept coming again and again for thousands of years. Those lava floods created a thickness of basalt unlike anything else in the world. And when that molten rock cooled, it didn't settle into random shapes. It cracked into columns that grew in long straight patterns almost like the earth was trying to sculpt itself. But even that explanation doesn't take away the strange feeling you get when you were standing right next to them. These columns rise up like ancient watchtowers. Each one a perfect slice of volcanic history hardened into stone that doesn't erode easily. Walk along the trails at Vantage and you will notice how quiet the place is. The wind echoes between the pillars, birds circle above the cliffs. The whole landscape feels like it's holding its breath. And that's before you hear the stories attached to this place. Indigenous nations who lived along the Columbia River have stories passed down through countless generations. Some talk about a time when the land was soft and reshaped by powerful beings. Others describe the cliffs as remnants of a great battle between ancient spirits where the rocks themselves were split open like giant shields. There are versions describing the pillars as frozen warriors or guardians turned to stone standing watch over the river for eternity. When you hear those stories in the place they came from, it's easy to understand why they survived. The basalt looks like it was sculpted by something more intentional than natural processes. One Yakama legend describes the basalt cliffs as the remains of a massive ancient barrier built by powerful beings to hold back chaotic waters. In the story, the river was once wild and destructive, tearing through the land and threatening everything along its path. The barrier cracked under pressure, fracturing into the columns we see today. It's a story filled with symbolism. But when you look at the cliffs, those tall vertical lines, those repeating geometric shapes, you can imagine how the old storytellers saw a wall there, something built, not born. There is also an older story from the Wainapan people about tall stone giants who lived along the river. These beings weren't hostile, but they kept their distance. They lived in quiet places towering over the land just like the basalt pillars. Some versions say the giants were eventually turned to stone as part of an ancient agreement becoming permanent guardians of the river. That explanation feels strangely fitting when you stand beneath the cliffs at dusk. The shadows stretch across the ground in long straight lines almost like tall figures standing shoulder to even in modern times. The basalt columns at Vantage carry an energy that's hard to describe. The air gets dry, the sky opens up, and then suddenly these towering pillars of stone rise out of the earth like something placed there on purpose. That spot is Vantage, and the basalt columns standing along the cliffs are just some of the most mysterious geological formations in the Pacific Northwest, wrapped in stories far older than science could reach. The thing about the basalt columns is that they don't look natural at first glance. They appear so straight, so perfectly geometric, and so deliberately patterned that you could easily believe they were ancient architecture. Long vertical pillars, flat-sided surfaces, stacked edges that fit together like pieces of a giant puzzle. When you first see them, your brain tries to sort them into something human, mad ruins maybe, or the fragments of a forgotten wall. But they're much older than any culture that ever lived here, and their origin story is almost as strange as the legends people tell about them. To really understand why these columns feel mysterious, you have to picture what this region looked like millions of years ago. Not the desert, not the open sky, not the calm river flowing through the canyon. Instead, imagine fire, lava spilling across the land in sheets so wide they covered entire counties. Eruptions that kept coming again and again for thousands of years. Those lava floods created a thickness of basalt unlike anything else in the world. And when that molten rock cooled, it didn't settle into random shapes. It cracked into columns that grew in long straight patterns almost like the earth was trying to sculpt itself. But even that explanation doesn't take away the strange feeling you get when you were standing right next to them. These columns rise up like ancient watchtowers. Each one a perfect slice of volcanic history hardened into stone that doesn't erode easily. Walk along the trails at Vantage and you will notice how quiet the place is. The wind echoes between the pillars, birds circle above the cliffs. The whole landscape feels like it's holding its breath. And that's before you hear the stories attached to this place. Indigenous nations who lived along the Columbia River have stories passed down through countless generations. Some talk about a time when the land was soft and reshaped by powerful beings. Others describe the cliffs as remnants of a great battle between ancient spirits where the rocks themselves were split open like giant shields. There are versions describing the pillars as frozen warriors or guardians turned to stone standing watch over the river for eternity. When you hear those stories in the place they came from, it's easy to understand why they survived. The basalt looks like it was sculpted by something more intentional than natural processes. One Yakama legend describes the basalt cliffs as the remains of a massive ancient barrier built by powerful beings to hold back chaotic waters. In the story, the river was once wild and destructive, tearing through the land and threatening everything along its path. The barrier cracked under pressure, fracturing into the columns we see today. It's a story filled with symbolism. But when you look at the cliffs, those tall vertical lines, those repeating geometric shapes, you can imagine how the old storytellers saw a wall there, something built, not born. There is also an older story from the Wainapan people about tall stone giants who lived along the river. These beings weren't hostile, but they kept their distance. They lived in quiet places towering over the land just like the basalt pillars. Some versions say the giants were eventually turned to stone as part of an ancient agreement, becoming permanent guardians of the river. That explanation feels strangely fitting when you stand beneath the cliffs at dusk. The shadows stretch across the ground in long straight lines, almost like tall figures standing shoulder to even in modern times. The basalt columns at Vantage carry an energy that's hard to describe. Climbers talk about it all the time. The place is popular for rock climbing, but almost everyone who goes there mentions how unusual the atmosphere feels. You are scaling these perfect pillars, gripping edges that formed millions of years ago. And every sound echoes as if the stone is hollow or listening. There's a strange mix of calm and intensity, quiet enough to make you feel alone, but sharp enough to keep you aware of every shift of wind. One climber I talked to described the columns as ancient cathedral walls, and honestly, that's not far off. When you stand between them, the lines draw your eyes upward. Everything feels vertical. And when the sun hits them in the late afternoon, the basalt glows this deep reddish brown, like the cliffs are waking up. You can understand how legends stuck to a place like this. What makes Vantage even more mysterious is the landscape around it. As you walk along the rim of the cliffs, the views open into a wide desert valley shaped by forces just as powerful as the volcanic eruptions that created the Missoula floods carved this region thousands of years ago. Floods so massive they reshaped the entire Pacific Northwest. Walls of water hundreds of feet high tore through the basalt, grinding it down, splitting it open, and leaving behind strange formations that don't quite match anything else in the world. Some people believe the basalt columns hide secrets about the earliest human migrations through the area. It's not unusual for archaeologists to find ancient tools or traces of early camps along the Columbia. The river was a major route for travel and trade centuries before Europeans arrived. And Vantage was a natural gathering spot, a place where the geography narrowed paths and encouraged people to stop. The cliffs may have served as landmarks, meeting points, even ceremonial sites. And if you've ever stood there at sunrise watching the golden light pour across the river, you can imagine how spiritually important this place might have been. There are also ongoing theories that the geometry of the basalt columns may have inspired early architectural ideas across the region. Straight lines, repeating patterns, interlocking shapes, it's hard not to see the resemblance when you compare them to some early wooden structures described in oral histories. The cliffs might have been early teachers, natural templates, a reminder that even in ancient times, the landscape shaped the way people built and understood their world. But for all the scientific explanations and all the old stories, the thing that really sticks with you is the experience of being there. The silence between the columns feels heavy in a way that doesn't happen in busy parks. The river moves slowly far below, winding through the canyon with this calm, steady presence. Hooks drift overhead in wide circles, and the basalt towers stand unmoving like pages in a book that the earth hasn't finished writing. When I visited Vantage last time, I remember stopping on a ledge just before sunset. The wind was cool and the cliffs were casting long shadows over the water. You could hear the faint rush of the river below, but everything else felt still. The basalt pillars rose up in perfect rows, and I had this moment of realizing just how old they are, millions of years old, older than mountains that have already eroded away. Older than the earliest human footsteps in this region, old enough that they hold time differently. Standing there at Easy to see why the ancient stories talk about guardians or frozen giants or old spirits shaping the land. The columns feel like they're watching, not in a threatening way, just present, like they remember everything that's passed through this canyon. Ice ages, floods, migrations, ceremonies, travelers, storms. The silence feels full of history. Today, Vantage is a mix of recreation and preservation. Climbers enjoy the cliffs, travelers stop for views, and the river still flows below like it has for thousands of years. But even with all that activity, the basalt columns keep their mystery. They're too old, too precise, too rooted in the earth to ever feel ordinary. And maybe that's what makes this place unforgettable. You come for the scenery, but you leave with a feeling, one that lingers long after you've driven out of the canyon, a reminder that some corners of the landscape carry stories older than humanity. Stories written in stone, still standing, still watching.